All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. It's 2 o'clock. Yay. I'm Carmen Matthews with the Texas Workforce Commission's accessibility team. And this presentation is for the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is amazing. We're so excited that all of you could join us for this. Today I'm going to talk about inclusive presentations for any audience. And I feel like it's one of those things where sometimes people are a little bit confused about what exactly this all entails. So I am going to tell you, this is normally a 3-hour presentation when I do it. And so we cut it down to, it'll be about 45 minutes or so of presentation today, where anything that is usually covered in the class that I don't cover today, though, you'll have a PDF. We're actually going to email you based on your email sign up. And I'm going to also see if the Governor's Committee can post the PDF on their website with our class information. And I think that they're also maybe posting the videos afterwards, so that can go along with that. And so if you want more information about anything that we normally present with this, you'll have that handout. A little bit about how the session is going to work. I have a few slides to start out with, and then there are going to be 2 times when I'm going to ask you questions, and I want you to answer me via the chat. The chat is public to all attendees, and your responses are going to be discussed by me, and I'm going to use that as feedback to help us kind of guide for examples and things like that of the way that we talk, what we talk about. And so if you're not familiar with the chat feature, there, with a keyboard, I mean, sorry, with a keyboard, you can hit Control-T to get to chat. Everybody else using a mouse, you should be able to see like a little control bar thing that has little icons on it. And if you don't see the chat one, it may be under the ellipses, the 3 dots there, and you can pull it up and type in there. Make sure you have choices inside of the chat, who you're typing to, and I would go with all panelists on that, and that will be to everybody, and that's the open chat. If you do have any questions, one of my coworkers is going to be she'll be monitoring the Q&A. So if you have questions about how to use the software, anything like that, leading up to it, you can ask in chat, but I would probably do it in Q&A. That way we're keeping that separate. And I will be monitoring chat as we go too, in case people have questions or anything like that as you go through. I see that somebody has a raised hand. If that's a question, can you actually either type it in chat or do a Q&A in the questions there instead of raising hands, because I don't want to start and stop and start and stop and all that while we're going through. So as we go through, I am going to give you a few minutes each time that we do have questions. If the first time it feels like that wasn't enough time, let me know in the chat and I'll extend the time the next time. So other than that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. For my purposes, when I talk about what a presentation is, a lot of times when people will say, I don't need this class because I don't do presentations. I don't teach, I don't instruct, I don't go to conferences and do that. To me, a presentation is anytime that you are talking to a group of people. So that's if you are holding a remote meeting. That is if you are even part of a remote meeting. If you are ever going to talk, you're presenting. That's if you're in a conference, whether that you're talking to a room of 10 people or 100 people or 400 people. If you're in a meeting room, you know, back when we used to do those meeting room things where people be like, oh, well, it's just my team. Well, your team is still an audience. And if you were talking talking to them, you need to keep in mind that you need to make sure that they get all of your information, so you're presenting. So don't think of presentations as just, oh, I don't present, that's not my job, because we all go to meetings and we all are on webinars and we all do all of those things. Even if you're at home in your living room, a lot of us are taking part in events like this. And so anytime you're the one talking, you're the one on camera, you're the one this or that, you're presenting. And one of the things that we hear a lot from people that we work with that have disabilities is that they have a hard time in meetings with their coworkers even, because they'll end up getting left out of the conversation because people just forget. And we don't want to be the people that forget. And so where was I going? I was going somewhere. So this class covers all kinds of tips on how to make sure that you don't leave anybody out of anything when you are presenting. But like I said, I'm going to focus on just one part of the class today, and that's the actual presentation part. So a little intro first though. What is accessibility? And I know a lot of people are like, I know what accessibility is, or I don't know what accessibility is. But one of the things that I found is even if you work with people with disabilities, that a lot of times our versions of what accessibility is are different. So for example, I'm an accessibility specialist. I can't say it, but I can do it. I do electronic accessibility. I make PDFs and Word documents and PowerPoints accessible. And so my version of accessibility is actually electronic accessibility. That's not what we're doing here with the presentations. That's some of it, because we want to make sure that our materials are accessible. But we are talking about whole approach now. And so in the handout that you're going to get, there's a blurb in there that, according to Disabled World, accessibility refers to the design of products, devices, services, or environments for people with disabilities. And when you are thinking about in a classroom environment or in a live environment where you're hosting, or even just on a webinar, a lot of the things that we think about for accessibility in that regard come into play. We have to think about the physical environment. We have to think about what kind of services are the services available to everybody, are the devices that we're asking people to use accessible, and things like that. And so we'll expand upon that as it applies to what we're doing as we go. But I will say too, that while the focus on accessibility is usually on people with disabilities, it by far makes everything better for everyone. And I'm probably preaching to the choir on this one, teaching, preaching, same thing. But a lot of times people people new to accessibility will be really surprised that, you know, oh, I redesigned that to make it accessible and it looks so much better. Like, it's so much easier to read for everybody. Or I did this to make this accessible, and whoa, or I just learned so much about design and approaches and this and that. And so if you think about it this way, it's not just, oh, I have to make this accessible because it's for so-and-so, or, oh, I have to present in this way because it's for so-and-so. That's not the case. You're actually making it better to where your information gets to everyone better if you make things accessible. So the next part of that, and I'm in the wrong thing, is what makes a presentation accessible. And so this one we made up with input from our some of our coworkers. And excuse me one second, I have kids at home. Okay, you gotta take it off. Presenting. So sorry. Take it off. So a presentation is accessible when everybody who attends has equal access to the information and is able to contribute to and participate in the event. And so one of the things to think about, 3 things with that. 1, equal access to the information. And so if you're like, okay, that's easy enough, right? Well, sometimes it's easy enough and sometimes it's not. And when we get into the part where we're discussing, you'll see so many times when people were left out of just having equal access to the information. But then taking it a step further, where being able to contribute to and participate in the event is huge. Because a lot of times what happens is that people with disabilities will be somewhere and they will have access to all the information, but there will be some kind of something where it's, you know, maybe it's an exercise in a classroom. Maybe it's some kind of breakout session for a group or something like that. And all of a sudden now they're left out. They can't contribute, they can't participate because whoever it was that coordinated it was only thinking about people who didn't have disabilities. So, and that wasn't that they were trying to be exclusionary or anything like that. I never think of this as malicious. I try to think of it as just a lack of awareness. And I'll admit, this is the first place I've ever worked with people with disabilities. My background was military and military contracting, and we just didn't have people with disabilities in those areas. And so coming here, I have learned so much about really including people and all of the things that as an instructor that I would take for granted when I would arrange classes and things like that. And now I know a little bit better, but I'm still learning every day. So I'm going to go further. And this is where we get into the chat time. So before we read this, I want you to all make sure that you have access to the chat and can get in there and answer this. And then I want you to think about a time when you attended an in-person meeting and didn't receive all of the information presented. I want you to tell me in chat as long or as little as possible what happened. Tell me a story. And it doesn't have to be a super long story. You can just say, hey, I attended this meeting. I'll give you an example. I attended a meeting one time and I had it where somebody was wearing a microphone and the microphone was pinned on the side of her body. And every time she spoke looking forward or looking to the side where her microphone was pinned, I could hear her talk. But every time she spoke mostly to the other side, I couldn't hear anything she said. And she was a head mover, not a body mover. If y'all are familiar with people, you know, everybody's got their different ways that they move. And so some people move their entire bodies and sometimes some people are very head movy. What she would do is she'd turn to the left and I couldn't hear her at all. And then she'd turn to the right and I could hear her. And then she'd turn to the left and then she'd turn to the right. I caught half of it, half of the presentation. And so thinking about some time like that where you can go, okay, oh my gosh, this is what happened, something like that, as detailed or as not detailed as you want. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes to type it in. It's 2:13. Keep in mind this is public, so no super embarrassing or crazy stories, just sometime when you were somewhere where you didn't receive all of the information. Again, if you're using a keyboard only, you should be able to access the chat with Control-T. I got 1 more minute if anybody wants to add anything or finish up. Ah. I must have been okay. No, now can you hear me? I was laughing because I'm fifths now. Okay, so I should have warned y'all at the very beginning. Zoom is not my bag, y'all, and so we were laughing before we started about we do a lot of Teams meetings, and but I'm hardly ever on Zoom, and so I am the worst with trying to navigate on Zoom and like remember to turn myself on mute and off mute and camera and this and I just don't use it enough. Okay, so y'all had some great stuff on here, and you'll have to excuse me looking to the side because of my setup. I have another screen off to the side where the chat is up, and y'all made me laugh so hard just now with these, and so I'm going to go through a few of them. One, I was presenting at a conference and asked if we would have an ASL interpreter, an American Sign Language interpreter. And I was told, no, we have a microphone and to speak loudly into the microphone. That's not how this works. That's fantastic. And so one of the things that we're not going to talk about today really, but you need to be aware of is that accommodations are different for different types of disabilities. And even with deaf and hard of hearing, there's a difference between having ASL or having or American Sign Language interpreters or having CART services, which is the captioning in real-time services, or speaking very loudly. And so all of those things are important. You do need to speak loudly enough for people to hear you. If an ASL interpreter was requested, or if CART service was requested, you need to have those. And I would think that if it was going to be a large conference that you would ask that ahead of time. But there are different preferences and there are different ways that people interact, and not all people who are deaf or hard of hearing use sign language. And so keeping all of those things in mind, there's a lot that goes on with meeting accommodations, and it's funny to me how sometimes people get them confused. And kind of like one of the examples I think of a lot of times is where you'll be watching a video and there will be captions that say the exact same thing that they put on the screen in words. And I'm like, if the people that need captions are reading it and they can see all the words on the screen that you put on there, so you didn't need to repeat it in the captions. It was always just kind of funny to me. multiple people talking about people speaking too quickly, and I am so guilty of that one. I am constantly, slow down, slow down. But a lot of times too, I find where, and one of the participants pointed this out, where it's trying to put too much information into one presentation. And that's one of the reasons that we're so big on handouts. If I use a handout and I send you with all the information that I want you to get, then I can focus on what I think is really important. And then you can take the information with you. And if you want more information, or if you need more information, you are able to read that. So another one where the instructor didn't share the activities she was doing with the class. And that's one of the things that anytime you get into a meeting or a presentation or any of those things, if you are the one hosting, if you're the one presenting, you need to tell people what to expect. And whether that is some kind of agenda where you're saying we're going to cover these things, if it's, it might be where you're going to have exercises that you're going to do. And so you're going to tell people to be prepared to be able to do something. Or it might, with activities really need to be prepped. I feel like, especially if you're in a classroom and you're expecting people to do things, or you're in a presentation, you're expecting people to do things. And I find that what happens is if you don't, it ends up whatever amount of time that you planned for this is going to get done takes 10 times longer. Maybe not 10 times longer, but at least twice as long. But you also exclude people, and people will not complete what you ask them to do, which often defeats the purpose of having the meeting or the presentation anyway. Let's see. With the microphones, one of the rules with that, and we've seen this a lot, and I did say to use a microphone, but I should caveat that. Two things. One, if you are going to be somewhere where you're talking, you should actually wear clothing that your microphone can attach to. A lot of times they're lavaliers, the little clippy ones, the little clippy microphones. And so the shirt I'm wearing right now is kind of a boat neck. I would not wear a boat neck shirt if I was going to go present somewhere that was bigger than, say, a small meeting room. Because if I was planning on wearing a lavalier, the boat neck puts the microphone too close to my face for it to work properly. Button down shirts, you can never go wrong, because you can go up and down the placket and clip wherever is best. But anything that is wide, anything like that, you end up with what I had, where it was the lady talking and you could hear her, and the lady that wasn't talking, you couldn't hear her. Also, it never works. Never once have I seen it. And obviously multiple people have had this issue here too. And I've heard this in class over and over, where somebody goes, oh, I don't need a microphone, I'm loud enough. You're just not. So, and if you are, a lot of times people end up yelling, and when you yell, it distorts your voice. And when you distort your voice, you make it harder for people to understand you. And you just defeated the purpose of being there and sharing your message, because people can't understand you. So anytime you're offered a microphone, take the microphone. I hate using microphones too. So I get it. I hate them, but I use them when I have to. So I'm going to go on. Running out of handouts, y'all, the handouts. That's an accessibility issue for, not the typical where we're thinking about, oh, it's people with low vision, or it's people who are deaf or hard of hearing, which are the two types of disabilities that most people think of. If you don't have handouts and you have somebody that's really trying to follow along that may have cognitive disabilities, or, even sometimes English as a second language, it's a lot easier sometimes, depending on how somebody learned to read, than it is to hear. Or, there's so many instances where that's helpful, but you should always have enough handouts for everybody. And while we're on the subject of handouts, you should have enough handouts for everybody. And about 10% of your handouts should be in large print, if you are not sure of who your audience is. And so if you're attending conference sessions, which is what this example was from, where they ran out of handouts, then you definitely I find out when I'm going to a conference how many people can fit in the room. How many people are allowed in that room? And once I find that out, I print those with usually maybe 10 more. And then 10% of those are large print. We usually do Braille too, but depending on the conference, but we do Braille in-house, so we have an advantage over that one. The projected information being too dim, so somebody didn't get that information. That's a really hard one, because really technically everything you do should pass color contrast, and that is a whole nother topic, but it's also so dependent on when you're projecting something, what the room is like, if you have control over the lighting that is coming in, if you have control over the overhead lighting and things like that, and having a whole lot of light in the room, if you do have control over it. If you don't and you have a whole lot of light in the room, sometimes it's just difficult, but if you do have control over it, many people with low vision have a hard time with a lot of light coming into the room. And so that might be something that you want to think about when you're setting up. More microphones, mumbling and speaking too quickly. And so in the handout, it's going to tell you that you should enunciate your words, don't mumble. I have found that a lot of the guidance that you'll see about giving presentations, they'll say enunciate, enunciate, enunciate. And I'm thinking, what if you just talk that way? Like, what if I sound Southern or this or that, and then I realize that it's not so much you just talk that way, it's that some people, when they are presenting to people or when they are in front of people talking, they tend to look down and they murmur. They're either looking at a handout, they're looking down at their hands, there's something like that. They're not comfortable speaking in front of an audience. And so a couple of things about that. One, you want to speak as clearly as you possibly can, and make eye contact. That's always important, but you always need to also be facing the audience while you're making eye contact, of course. Anytime that you look down, you're now projecting your voice not straight out to the audience, you're projecting your voice down from the audience, and it makes it harder to hear. Also, some people lip read, and if you're looking down, they can't see your lips. Where was I? I lost that. One of the other things about that with having an audience is if you have multiple people in the audience that are going to be speaking, you want them to do the same. You want them to look at the audience when they're talking. You want them to enunciate and be loud enough. If you have an option, you want them to use a microphone when they ask questions or when they speak. And one of the things that I've heard about before from another attendee was that they were at a conference and the chairs were set up in rows all facing the front, because we know conferences come in all different shapes and sizes, right? And so it was a huge conference room. Everybody is facing the front. They had microphones for people to ask questions, or no, they didn't have microphones for people to ask questions. And so somebody would stand up and they would be facing the front and they would have a bunch of people behind them. They would ask the question. The person presenting would not repeat the question. They would just answer it. And so anybody that was behind the person that asked the question had no idea what the question was because they couldn't hear. And so having a microphone for the question and answer sessions helps, having people walking around the room for that, or having the person that's presenting just repeat the question. And so if you're in a live presentation, that's where the microphone, or live in-person presentation, that's where the microphone comes in. If you're on a webinar though, what you can do is if somebody asks you a question, say in chat, you can repeat the question and then answer the question. And it's amazing how small things like that, if you're thinking, well, gosh, why is that? It's huge, y'all. That is a big deal. It leaves a lot of people out. Even just people that maybe you had an option to call into a meeting instead of attend it. If I had a chance to call into Zoom as opposed to attending it via video, and I didn't have an option to use the chat, then that's a big deal. Another one that is interesting is one about attending a yoga class for beginners where most of the people in the room had taken it before and the movements and poses weren't explained in depth because it was assumed that everybody knew them. I've been in other classes like this before though, where somebody doesn't explain what's going on or how to do things in depth because there's an assumed level of knowledge. You really should base all of your content on the lowest level that you think people would be. I often go for a medium where I think, okay, I'm going to hit the medium level of where I think that the people in the audience are going to be at. But two, I often will then go back and explain things at a more beginner level because you just don't know. And so if you don't, you can lose members of your audience and you don't want to do that. Let's see what else. Oh, this is a good one. Attending a human rights conference and all the information presented was in print. So even though it was discussed briefly and it was in print, I'm assuming that an electronic accessible version was needed. And also another one that was talking about low vision and not having big enough print on the PowerPoint. So we talked about having big enough print on your handouts, but also having big enough print on the PowerPoint. We look at PowerPoints all the time, y'all, and I see PowerPoints sometimes with 22-point font or 18-point font. And I'm just like, you know, if you're projecting especially, you never know what your screen's gonna look like. We try to keep our PowerPoint fonts big. I don't go below 40 on a slide. A lot of people like to have a whole lot of information on slides though. So I would say no further. No, I recommend when people do it, it's no lower than a 32. So some other things that I wanted to talk about, sorry, I was looking at the chat to see if there were any more that I wanted to cover. Using non-visual language. And so a lot of times, here, let me get to my group discussion slide here. You'll hear people say on this slide, or see here, or as you can see. It's not saying that you can't use those words. You can use words like that, but the difference is you can't use words like that without identifying what they're seeing. As you can see, there are 6 gorillas sitting in the woods and looking at some kind of fruit. As you know, this chart that is showing you blah, 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 blah. So don't go assuming that everybody can see it. And one of the things with that is too, that a lot of people that have low vision, you don't know that they have low vision just by looking at them. And so it's really important to just kind of, if you don't know the audience, I assume that most people are that there's going to be somebody in there that has low vision, and I'm going to explain whatever the visuals are. Another thing that we hear a lot, different type of disability, is from people who are hard of hearing, that it's really important to make sure that only one person speaks at a time. And there was another panelist came in and said that, where there was a lot of speaking in the back of the room and that a lot of people were speaking at the same time. It makes it really hard for people to process information or to hear information when more than one person is speaking. So as the person who is hosting the meeting, as the person who is presenting, you really need to make sure that you're controlling the room. And if you're uncomfortable with that, you can always have a co-presenter who can be the bad person that goes and I'll come. I love breaking up people talking and do that. The other part of that is if more than one person is going to speak, I like to have people introduce who it is. And so one of the things that we have going on a lot of our meetings is that it is required when you talk, you say who it is. And it's as simple as, this is Carmen, blah, 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 blah. This is Jane, blah, 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 blah. And that way you're not expecting everybody to remember what your voice sounds like, because that's just silly. And if there are 30 people or 40 people or something like that in a meeting, you can't assume that somebody knows who everybody is, even if you can see them on video or anything like that. And so really important to make sure that people know who it is that is talking. Explain the structure. There is, there, that works. Okay, so I want to talk one more time. Let's see. I'm going to make sure I didn't have anything that I missed that was just, okay, I have some about Zoom. So we're actually going to move on for that. I'm going to actually finish up about in-person meetings, and then we're going to talk about remote meetings just a little bit. So with the in-person meetings, some other things to make sure. One, if you have a roster that people are going to sign, you need to make sure that you're prepared to help people sign that. A lot of times what I will do is just say, hey, do you mind if I sign the roster for you while they're getting settled in and things like that? And a lot of people are fine with that, but I always ask. I don't assume that people would want me to sign the roster. I just say, hey, do you mind? And if they do, if they want to sign it themselves, fine, let me bring it to you. Let me assist you however I can. I find that a lot of people, though, at least where I work, they don't, you know, they're not interested in, oh my gosh, I have to sign the roster myself. So the other part of that is sitting or standing where everybody can see you. A lot of times this means with no podium. I have to say, y'all, I'm 5'2", 5'3", and if I stand behind most podiums, I'm a floating head. That is the weirdest way to present ever. And so you're presenting a disconnect for the people that are looking at you. And a lot of times if it's that close up, you may, you know, you're blocking your hand signals and your body language and all of that. And so I don't stand in front of podiums. Looking at the audience, using the microphone. If you write on a surface, oh my goodness, y'all. Okay. So I went to a workforce conference a few years ago, and we're in this big old conference room, and it's probably, I mean, it's not a huge one, right? It was a small one for that, but it was, I don't know, 20 by 50, right? And there's a guy up front, and he's presenting, and I swear with no microphone, and the room is really dark, so dark. And he has one of those flip charts, you know, the flip charts that are like, I don't know, 20 by 30 paper flip charts and markers. And not just markers, not like black markers or blue markers, like medium green and orange markers. And is talking to the audience and writing stuff on the flip chart as he's going in what seems like big print to him because he's standing in front of it. But I was towards the back of the room because I came in late. I couldn't see a thing. I couldn't see what he was writing. I couldn't hear him. I stayed for 3 minutes and I left. And I was just like, oh my gosh. I could not believe he didn't, you know, if he wanted people to get that information, do it in a different way. You can't, if you're going to write something down, you need to make sure it's large enough for everybody to read. The other part of that is if you're wondering, well, what about people who are blind? Say what you're writing as you're writing it, and that's helpful. But if you're going to be, what you're doing when you write something down is you're presenting something as a medium to the people who can see it, right? And if you're presenting it as a medium that somebody can see it, then you need to make sure that they can actually read it. And so you need to have large enough writing. My handwriting is so bad that I tend not to write anything down in front of people because I know that they can't read it. So if that's the case, then what do? I pull up a Word document and type it. I spend most of my presentations on computers anyway, though, but if I want them to see things as I'm, you know, if they're giving me input and they're this and they're that, and I have a computer right here, I can just type it. And it can be nice and it can be huge font and everybody can read it because it's not in my chicken scratch and it's lovely. If you are going to ask the entire audience a question, and again, this is in person, make sure that you have more than one way to answer because some people can't answer you verbally and some people can't raise their hands and some people can't do certain things. And so if you tell them that they can do multiple things like raise your hand, clap, nod, give a verbal response or something like that, then everybody can participate. The other part of that is if you do ask a question of the entire group, you need to also recap. And so it might be, hey, you know, how many of y'all love cats? Raise your hand or nod your head or say yay. And then you can, after everybody does it and you get a count, you can say, okay, we have about 50 people in here and every single one of them loves cats, because I mean, you know, they're cats, right? So something like that. Don't just take a poll and then not give the information. I've seen this too on slides where people will have, they'll have a polling little doodads, you know, where you press a button, or maybe there's an app that they ask you to download on your phone and it all comes up on the screen and they'll say, okay, here are the results. Okay, well, what are the results? You need to actually tell everybody. And that makes a huge difference. So make sure that anything that you're doing visually, you tell people. So I want to ask you to, now we're going to go on to remote meetings. And some of you did answer about remote meetings just a minute ago, but I would like you to, if you haven't answered about remote meetings yet, if you just take a few minutes and tell me about a time when you were in a remote meeting or a webinar that you didn't get all of the information presented. And then we're just going to spend a few minutes kind of going over remote meetings and webinars. It's 2:43. I'm going to give you only 4 minutes on this one, so be done at 2:47, and we'll talk about them. Maria, I'm on mute. That may be why you can't hear. Everybody has 2 more minutes to enter in anything that, any input on a time that they were on a webinar or a remote meeting where they couldn't get the information. Got 1 more minute to finish up. All right. One comment that I didn't read that came in a little bit ago that I think is really probably the best way to explain the whole reason why this course came about. One of the participants said, when I did not receive all the information presented at a meeting, I felt left out. I was a bit lost as to what was being discussed, and I felt like an outsider, that I was the only one who didn't know what the presenter was discussing. So I'm not sure, I don't think I said this earlier, but the whole reason why we even created this, and we actually present this fairly regularly at our agency, is because we had people with disabilities coming to us and saying that they would go to trainings, or they would go to meetings, or they would go to even just like informal kind of, you know, the lunchtime things where you have the employee committees or something like that, and they would be totally left out of them. And so you can imagine the exclusionary feeling of that, and just how devastating I think that would be. I feel like I have some coworkers who are legally blind and have been to multiple trainings with one of them, and actually ended up, you know, saying, hey, you know, I need you to, you know, if you're going to be presenting this stuff, we need to kind of revisit the way you're doing it. I went to one time that I still find amusing, where there was a state trooper came and did an active shooter training for our agency. And we had 3 people in the front row who were very obviously blind. They had white canes and guide dogs. And a lot of the training was videos. And so you would hear videos of live situations that those things happened in, but the instructor was wanting you to watch the videos and see how people were responding, but all you could do was hear what was going on. And if you've ever seen one of those videos, what you can hear is not what's going on, as far as where people are moving to and things like that. And he wasn't telling anybody either. And so finally we got to, I was very new to accessibility at the time. And so I hadn't really found my angry voice. And, but now it comes out fairly frequently, but where I was just like, you have people who are blind in the audience. You have to tell them what's going on with the videos. And he was just like, oh, I mean, had just never even, you know, thought about it. And so it was one of those things that they were just totally left out, and probably would have been had, you know, somebody not said anything. So I'm going to go back to the webinars and remote meetings. One of the things that was brought up in a couple of times was the navigation, how to use the software. A lot of us are very new to this, to the Teams, to the Zoom, and I admit that I am spot on with Teams, and I've only used Zoom a couple of times, and it's usually been in things where other people were hosting for me. So it is hard. It is hard to use, and so a lot of the ones that are in here are technical things where people weren't sure how to mute or unmute, or not sure how to use the software. And some of these, you know, if you're an assistive technology user or a keyboard user, you have to learn new commands or new ways to navigate that might be very different than what you're used to. And there's a learning curve there. And sometimes it's very frustrating, especially if you don't get to practice that learning curve. So there is that, and that's something to keep in mind. making sure that, you know, what platform you're using is accessible. And then two, if somebody needs help with that, can you help them? People talking about other technical issues, like with things getting dropped and so they lose audio or they lose video or they lose both, and then not being able to recapture the information. So that goes back to, for me, we always have a handout, right? I try to record everything, but we also always have a handout so that people will have the information even if they don't have the video. Something else that is important, we already talked about letting the audience see you in person. It's really important too that if you do video, you let people see you. Again, some people are lip readers, and if they're able to see you, they can gather a lot of information that way. On top of that, also though, is having proper lighting. And so I don't know how many of y'all have been in meetings where somebody's like backed up to a window and all you can see is their silhouette. It always cracks me up, because I'm like, I know you can see yourself, and you're thinking, oh, well, my hair's not done, or this or that, or whatever. I didn't want to put on makeup because I'm sitting at home. Whatever those excuses are, if you're going to be talking to people via video, you really should have to where they can see you. It's important. I know that some of our teams, I was in a meeting yesterday with a whole group, and they're like, we don't turn on our videos. And I'm like, why? You know, I'm not judging y'all for being in your pajamas, I can assure you, but I do want to be able to read your body language and try to discern what you're saying to me and things like that. And that means being able to see you and have proper lighting. So if your entire face is not visible and people can't see your expressions, that's a problem. Trying to minimize background noise is important on the webinars, and which is often very difficult if you're in a home with other people. A headset with a built-in microphone helps immensely, but that's not always in the cards for everybody. So just, you know, do the best you can. Let's see. What else do we have? Giving extra time when you're on webinars or some such for people to ask for them to answer questions, right? And so a lot of the classes that I do on webinar are more technical, like we're talking about making Word documents accessible or making Excel spreadsheets accessible, something like that. You have to keep in mind that if you ask people questions somewhere where they're normally muted because you have so many people on, that you have to give them time to navigate to unmute themselves. And back to if that's an assistive technology user or a keyboard user, sometimes they have to navigate through multiple windows because their focus will be somewhere else. So you need to make sure that you're giving people time to be able to do that. I tend to be very impatient, and so it makes it hard for me to go, I have to sit back when I'm on webinars and go, okay, 1, 2, and give people enough time. Ooh, here's a good one. Feedback, having feedback on these calls. We see it a lot where people will have sometimes they'll have 2 meetings going or something like that on there that are the same one, and they'll get feedback. Sometimes the only way to fix it is to actually put headphones on. So I recommend that even if you're very anti-headphone, which I am, I can't stand wearing them, that you have some available just in case. Like I have some sitting right here just in case I actually need to put them on, because I don't want to be right in the middle of something and then, oh my gosh, people can't hear me, there's a whole lot of feedback, something like that, and then the whole meeting is ruined. Speaking of another one, changing platforms was on here. That is definitely mid-meeting a big no. That's one of those you'll just reschedule it. Docs provided, submit after the meeting, which can be a pain because you don't want to read the info while attending the meeting. This other one is talking about sound issues with the mix of having people call in versus over the computer and things like that, going through the slides too fast, presenting information too quickly. All of those things can be an issue. And it's really important to, and it's hard, I think, because you can't get feedback as well when you're not in person, right? You just can't see people. And so it makes a big difference when you're on a webinar. So as is typical for me, I am only 3 minutes left in here. So if you would like, if anybody has any questions, you can type them in here. I can stay on for a few more minutes and answer anything that you want. Again, we will send you materials as we get your email address, right? My coworker said to remember that screen readers don't read Zoom or Teams presenter windows, which is a really good point. So an example of that is, I just pulled up the thank you to our partners screen, and it has icons for all of the partners for the ADA 30th. There is no way that a screen reader would get that information because it's just a picture to them, it's just a video. And so if you wanted everybody to get that information, I would actually say Knowbility and Southwest ADA Center and Texas Workforce Solutions and TDLR and all of that, and that would be covered. Or you could put it in your handout. Right, so you have to read it. All right, y'all, thanks so much. Again, if you have questions, let me know. My email address is carmen.matthews@twc.state.tx.